Hello, and welcome back to the Crypt. Today, we're going to be talking about 5 myths that you have had sold to you, and probably have believed at some point, regarding the paranormal. So, sit back, relax, and turn down the lights, as we together open the Book of Common Terror. Our world is only ever haunted. Ahoy! We are back with another installment of the Book of Common Terror, where we explore the weird and the eerie with the help of a trusty 1979 Book of Common Prayer riding shotgun. Now, we have covered a lot of ground already, conceptually and historically, and it's about time that we start getting to the meat and potatoes of the weird and the eerie. So today, we're going to be discussing myths surrounding the paranormal, because I think it's important to confront some of the from-the-hip objections that get raised concerning this line of inquiry. So there will be some demolition work where we clear out some unnecessary obstacles for our exploration. Yes, I think it's also important for us that we clarify what it is that we're talking about when we talk about this weird stuff. So, I want to go straight out the gate into these myths that turn people away from taking the weird and the eerie seriously in any way, shape, or form. So without any further ado, let's start with number 1. It's only kooks who see this stuff. Right? False. No. World-renowned smart guy Stephen Hawking said in a 2008 TED Talk, "I am discounting reports of UFOs. Why would they appear to only cranks and weirdos?" That doesn't seem very polite. But it's a popular conception. Who is it that sees weird stuff? Weird people. Crackpots. Rogues. Ruffians. Rapscallions. Ne'er-do-wells. Ewoks. What? People who don't have it all together. White trash. The uneducated. The fringe. Addicts. The lower class. You know, the people that we always want to distance ourselves from and say that that's not us. And I think reliance on this myth is a really clever way to have this imaginary distance between us and them, whoever they are. We always posit a them to separate ourselves from this unideal version of what we don't want to be, but in part always are. We always have these idealized visions of ourselves that we imagine. And all the inconvenient parts of what we actually are, we then project onto others. And we say, oh, that's not us. We're not them. And I really think that the weird and the eerie put a very pointed question mark on all of our plausibility structures that allow us to maintain these illusions. Because you have the likes of Arthur Conan Doyle, Pierre and Marie Curie, Winston Churchill, Harry Truman, and Jimmy Carter, who have all seen specters and UFOs. And even Barack Obama has said that he and Michelle have heard things outside their room in the White House, that they and others in their family have felt something invisible gnawing at their feet, which is a kind of horrifying thought to consider. But it is definitely not just weirdos, whoever they are, that see this stuff. Reputable people bear witness to strange occurrences somewhat regularly. Newell Partridge of Salem, West Virginia, may have encountered Mothman outside of his home. He heard a strange, high-pitched sound outside of his house, and his dog, Bandit, rushed out after it. When Newell shone a flashlight outside, he said that he saw 2 red eyes glowing back at him, and though he had a gun, he was too afraid to go out after it. Bandit, unfortunately, never returned. But people took Newell Partridge seriously. He was a local contractor with a good reputation. And it was only later, he said, after reading about the slate of Mothman sightings in Point Pleasant, that he began to wonder if there was a connection to what he saw. So, is Newell Partridge a crackpot? I don't think so, because people who knew him don't seem to think so. Artists from Vasily Kandinsky to, of course, William Butler Yeats. And if you don't know that, you should look more into that dude. But both of them were very interested in the occult and participated in occult practices. Look, I mean, even the skeptical Sigmund Freud began eventually to acknowledge the possibility of telepathy and psychokinesis after observing demonstrations of the phenomena with vetted psychics. Physicist Wolfgang Pauli had regular bouts of poltergeist phenomena. Alan Turing was convinced that telepathy was a genuine phenomenon. And A.J. Ayer, the big daddy of logical positivism, had some weird sort of afterlife experience after he was clinically dead for 4 minutes. So, what do you do with that? Oh, this just in. It appears it is not only the Oxford educated who get to dictate what is and is not real. Whoops. Number 2. It's all imaginary. Well, what does that even mean? I think that people present that objection as though it is completely clear, manifest, unmistakable what they mean when they say that something is imaginary. It's imagined. It has no basis in concrete reality. But there are all sorts of things in reality. Our shared fabric of social reality that are imagined. Even much of our own psychic lives is an imagined relation between ourselves and the image of ourselves that we want to present to the world and to ourselves. Imaginary relations obtain in so much of life all the time. Also, is the imagination to be denigrated because it can conceive of things that are not here right in front of me? Again, I think that this plays into the myth of a monolithic and omnipotent science that knows all and judges all. In his book Irrationality, A History of the Dark Side of Reason, Justin E.H. Smith speaks about the kind of political discourse that surrounded the 2016 election cycle. He writes, "When in 2016 politics became largely a matter of meme warfare, we were thrust into a situation in which not only could we not pretend we were living in a deliberative democracy, but we had now abandoned even the aspiration to this, in favor of a pursuit of politics at a purely cultural level. This politics, with mimetic myths and tall folktales, has ancient roots in the free play of the imagination among people who had no hope of participating in the political life of their societies. Imagination is a powerful tool, but as the faculty of which no one, not even the most disenfranchised and uninformed, can be deprived, it is also often deployed in desperation. Imagination is like a bright colored dye infused into a cell on a microscopic slide. It makes the invisible visible, even as it distorts and perhaps endangers the thing we had wanted to see, to know, by means of it. And this is an important point to raise here. The imagination is not something that stands apart from and opposed to rationality. Imagination is not only the domain of desperate escape, nor is it simply the organ of fantasy. It is the means by which we posit a coherent universe. There is no science without imagination. After all, hypothesis works from observation and imagines unseen factors, then uses that same faculty to develop experimentation to test those hypotheses. The method that we often take for granted as scientific finds its origin in human imagination, dealing in the realm of what ifs. You see, imagination and science are not intrinsically opposed to one another. I really like what Noah Berlatsky writes in a review of Lawrence Lipking's book, What Galileo Saw, Imagining the Scientific Revolution. He writes, "The pop culture account of science is one of continuous advancement and ever clearer sight, or, alternately, one of ever-encroaching spiritual death, as cold technology alienates us from our true selves. But both narratives of progress and those of apocalypse erase the extent to which the scientific revolution was fired by religious fervor. Galileo, forced to recant his heliocentrism by the church, nobly refused to be swayed by myths or orthodoxies and boldly declared, 'Nevertheless, it moves.' Except there's no record that he said that. The rejection of myths and orthodoxies is itself a myth, one of the founding stories of modernity's science code. The fact that the early scientific greats had numerous loopy ideas isn't usually seen as that much of a problem. Kepler's record as both an astronomer and an astrologer can be dismissed with mutterings about the superstitions of the time. The astrology is jettisoned, and the pure science is preserved. Disaggregating isn't necessarily always that easy, though. For example, Francesco Sizzi, one of Galileo's critics, looked through the spyglass too, and where Galileo saw the moons of Jupiter, Sizzi saw nothing. Was this because he had poor eyes, or a bad telescope? Maybe, Lipking writes, students of vision have repeatedly demonstrated that seeing something involves the mind as well as the eyes. Based on what we know now about science, Sizzi failed to see because he lacked a theory that would put those moons into context. Galileo, on the other hand, could see because he had the right theory. Evidence does not lead to theory. Theory provides the context for evidence, which means that Galileo's discoveries came not just from a dispassionate evaluation of what he saw, but from his imagination. And if he imagined those moons of Jupiter, are we still imagining them with him? The border between the real and the imaginary is never as airtight and contained as many rationalists would claim that it is. It is always more porous than that. And while the imaginary can obscure and distort the real, certainly that is possible, it also can serve as the means by which we apprehend and negotiate the real. So, number 3, it's all a bunch of hoaxes. Now, let me be upfront. The history of cryptozoology, parapsychology, paranormal investigation, any kind of exploration of weird stuff has involved and uncovered countless hoaxes. There's no point in trying to pretend otherwise. And there's no virtue in, while believing in the authenticity of the phenomena, going down with a sinking ship by insisting, no, it's all real. Everything anyone has ever said was real. We should be honest and completely forthright about how many hoaxes there have been. Because there have been extensive hoaxes. We don't help ourselves or our project by pretending otherwise. But all hoaxes? All hoaxes? Every single instance of something strange and inexplicable and preternatural? Every instance of this was a hoax? That has no basis in the data. There is no conclusion issued by some magisterial committee that has said so. And then the question raises itself, who appoints that committee? What credentials make someone apt to serve on such a magisterium? No, they are not all hoaxes. We can look at certain instances of hoaxes. We can look at the surgeon's photograph of Nessie. Yes, it's a hoax. Yes, the gamble footage of the Michigan Dogman is a hoax. Yes, numerous crop circles have been hoaxes, and people have shown us exactly how they perpetrated it. Yes, Florida's giant penguin was a hoax. And no offense to Florida, but it's a very Florida man move. But I think it's fallacious to claim that the number of hoaxes, however many there are, somehow nullifies the very possibility of these things being. Now, suppose 99% of all eyewitness accounts are false, outright false, and can be explained as either mistakes or hoaxes. That 1% would unsettle everything about the regnant paradigm. The weird may not be typical, but if it is real, then the typical simply isn't as determinative of reality as we suppose it to be. The official story of our world, it just doesn't accommodate the incorrigible weirdness of experience. A construal of reality that cannot accommodate surprising and inexplicable events just cannot be the whole story. Or are we just utterly committed to a story of the world in which this is just the way things are? The alienation of late modern capitalism is just the way it is. Which leads us to the closely related number 4. Science has disproven all of this. Oh, there it is again. Big science with the capital S. We've addressed that before in the introductory video. But the Inigo Montoya in me does have to point out.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
It doesn't work that way. That can't happen. And the people who think that that is possible, or even plausible, I don't think they really have their philosophy of science down. There's a confusion here on what exactly it is that science is, and what it does. And it is very widespread. And just stay calm. I'm not an anti-vaxxer. But trust the science, in scare quotes. That's not a great credo to live by. The science, at various times, has pushed all sorts of ideological agendas that have been harmful to human being, and that have been, beneficial to the ruling class. Imagine that. Science has unleashed all sorts of horrifying things. Look at Oppenheimer, who says, after the fact, hey, when you're a scientist and something looks technically sweet, you go for it. And then you think about the ramifications afterwards. So, wiping 2 cities off the face of the planet. Hey, that's just one of those unfortunate byproducts of looking into what's technically sweet, right? So there's not really an ingrown principle of moderation or course correction within this thing because there's not, as I have said before, a science. As a matter of fact, there's not even really a scientific method. The philosopher of science, Paul Feyerabend, in his book, Against Method, makes much of how there is no universal scientific method. And he is in favor of John Stuart Mill's principle of all views are available at the table. Mill was of the opinion that silencing the views of others that are possibly completely false only leads to your own view becoming enshrined as a dogma, something to be venerated and accepted with the fervency of a religious belief, and it will then stand dogmatically apart from rational grounds. It becomes the party line that must be towed because it is the party line that must be towed. That is always the danger in simply attempting to eradicate the views of others. And again, I'm not a relativist. I am in no way pretending that all views are equally valid, equally true. I am saying that the ideological warfare that simply tries to bury the views of those who are wrong only ever sow the future seeds of their own downfall, because the clamping down that seeks to simply annihilate difference only ever shores up reaction. And Galileo figures in with Feyerabend here as well. In Against Method, Feyerabend reconstructs the entire Galileo episode, and he makes the case that Galileo did not justify his hypothesis by reference to universally accepted facts, and he didn't offer a falsifiable conjecture with a greater empirical basis than what he sought to replace. And according to Karl Popper, falsification is at the heart of what the program of science is. So here we are with one of the paragons of modernity who mythically turned his back on myths and orthodoxies, as we've already mentioned. And he did not subscribe to the myth that now enshrines him as a forefather of the mythic school, which is how myth always works. The founder of that which we would say that we are never ever belongs to us, and we only ever load that individual down with views, opinions that they never had, and surround them with all this flotsam and jetsam. And then it is incumbent on us to screen out and to jettison everything that pokes holes at what we need to be true of ourselves and about what we are doing. So Galileo just plain doesn't fit the mold of the demythologized modern scientist. And his own method demonstrates that there is not a single universally valid and universally accepted scientific method. In Against Method, Feyerabend says the scientific method, when you get down to it, is anything goes. And he doesn't mean absolute relativism here. He is arguing for an epistemological anarchy in the sense of there's not a ruler who is constantly refereeing and ruling, hey, nope. Because he notes that across the history of science, discoveries are made, new postulates developed, and it's in these punctiliar moments of, oh, huh, where imagination is key, where suddenly something is seen differently. There simply is not a single shape to how that development takes place or plays out. That is the point. And so, science, I again have to say, what are you talking about when you use that word? And just downstream from that is number 5. Modernity is disenchanted. Well, let's pump the brakes a bit, because what does disenchantment mean? Well, it's not a univocal concept. Let's say that right at the outset. It's a little malleable in what it denotes. Disenchantment is a common paradigm used by scholars and by lay people who don't feel at home in the present. And it's used to typify this wonderlessness of the modern era. Admittedly, that's the more colloquial sense. In a more sociological vein, it describes the devaluation of religion, both institutionally and symbolically, under the conditions of modernity. The phrase, and the use of the phrase, it originates from a Max Weber lecture in which he asserted that instrumental reason, the sort of rationality of a purely engineering sort, preoccupied with profitable outcomes and the most efficient means for procuring them, and warned how instrumental reason had contributed to the disenchantment of the world. Disenchantment has enabled the exploitation of the natural world and of human beings as well, as the desacralizing of place and creatures and practice meant that everything that didn't add to the efficiency of the capitalist profit-making machine and to scientific development, it was just unimportant and better left in the supposedly primitive and embarrassing past. But here again, this is where Jason Josephson Storm's The Myth of Disenchantment helps us so much, because he marshals historical evidence to demonstrate that many of the principal protagonists of the narrative of disenchantment were actually deeply involved in the occult and the magical. Whoops, because how can that be if they're so dedicated to uprooting superstition and magical thinking? Well, it's because many of them weren't. You see, as so often is the case, historical detail gets sacrificed when it's inconvenient to the story that someone or a group wants to tell. And for some people, the story of capital R reasons overcoming of irrationality in the form of magic, superstition, and religion, it was just too important to be disturbed by the finer points of what actually transpired in history. There are 2 ways that disenchantment goes. One is the staunchly rationalist version of this that applauds disenchantment, that sees this as a gain, that looks at the past as something to be broken from as quickly as possible, to utterly leave behind in the dustbin of history, and is always on the lookout for the supposed arc of the universe bending towards whatever it is, whether it's superior rationality, justice, whatever the case may be, a version of progress that is always just over the horizon. Now, there is another version of the disenchantment story that plays more to what I'm trying to do, but I still want to distance myself from. Because those who lament disenchantment then say, well, then we must re-enchant the world. And this is especially true for Christians who belong to a more high church tradition, like I do. For some of these folks, The Reformation is the villain that sent mystery and magic and wonder packing back in 1517. So, part of the evangelistic appeal here is essentially asking, hey, are you sick of feeling like a replaceable cog in an impersonal machine? Well, get you some reenchantment. And there's appeal to that, because while the broader story of disenchantment may not be true, this connects with what I was saying earlier about alienation in late modern capitalism. Many of us do sense that this is all out of joint. This is not how it's supposed to be. I think it's important to remember that at no time in human history have things been how they are supposed to be. But man, it seems we just cannot ignore that intuition in our time and place. We feel how vapid and replaceable so much of what we do is. We feel the futility of what we do deep in our bones. We feel our spirit disintegrating as we succumb to this meaningless repetition to get by. I do not, however, think that it is incumbent upon us to re-enchant the world. I don't think that it has been disenchanted, except insofar as persons and institutions have bought into the story of disenchantment. And I don't think that you or I can create enchantment. I think that it simply is highly inconvenient, both for hard-nosed skeptics and for re-enchanters alike, that the history that the myth of disenchantment covers, it unearths how nothing is as straightforward as any of us have assured ourselves it is. Because for both parties, it means acknowledging that the ostensible heavy hitters of disenchantment, whether understood as heroes by the former or as villains by the latter, well, they thought that spooks and spells and mind reading were real phenomena. For all of us, whoever we are, that demands that we do the hard work of examining the ideology that keeps us afloat in our life world. More than that, we need to smash the idols that disenchant us and keep us preoccupied from the real world. After all, our world is only ever haunted. So, re-enchantment, I don't think is necessary. I would say instead, look around and listen to people. There's no need to re-enchant because this is a spooky world as it is. Listen to the voices that you tend to exclude. None of us need to make our world strange again. It's never stopped being strange. So, those were 5 myths regarding the paranormal. If you learned something, or if your awareness of something deepened through this, then please make sure to like this and subscribe to the Book of Common Terror. Thank you for tuning in. I hope that this awakens a sense that there is more possible in our world than it often feels like there is. And frankly, I hope that some of how the world seems boring and dry and insipid, maybe that retreats a little bit in hearing someone else talk about these subjects. So, stick around, stay tuned. There is definitely more coming down the pipe from the Book of Common Terror. Thank you again. I appreciate it so much. And I'll see you in the next video. Ian, out.